The National Consumers League accuses the coffee giant of lying about being ethically sourced.
Starbucks Coffee Company unequivocally, and let me set the tone for this very early on, has not broken the law.
Thinking that's not expensive is crazy.
Oh, hell no, man.
A Starbucks coffee is something I don't often indulge in myself, but it's clear that I'm in the minority here. Even at $7 or more a cup, it's just something that many caffeine consumers just can't get enough of. So many, in fact, that the word Starbucks is now essentially a synonym for coffee shop. That's not an award that many other brands get, by the way. But it's not for no reason. As of July 2025, there are over 17,000 Starbucks locations in the US, which is almost enough to fill the entire state of New Hampshire and make it completely unlivable. They're getting there. But behind the absolutely massive success of Starbucks is a more twisted and bitter economic story. This is John. John lives in Brazil, the largest coffee producing country in the world. Now John is about to turn 16 and was just recruited to work on a farm that supplies the top coffee house chain in America, Starbucks. Soon after his birthday, he was transported to the farm where he quickly found himself working sunup to sundown, 5:30 a.m. to 6 p.m. every single day. John never got paid. The farm owner never got punished for overworking him. He lived in these conditions until he was finally rescued in a raid by Brazilian authorities in June of 2024.
Então, o trabalho está sendo interrompido para vocês hoje.
Starbucks never really intended on just being a coffee shop. In fact, when it was first founded in 1971, it didn't even sell coffee at all. It just sold beans, tea, and spices. Now, it wasn't until 12 years later when a guy by the name of Howard Schultz, who would eventually become the CEO, returned from a trip to Italy. Inspired by the vibe of Italian coffee shops, he thought to himself, what if coffee was an experience, not just a product? After buying the company in 1987, he acted on that thought and turned Starbucks into what it is today, a coffee shop with a nice, relaxing environment. His big idea was that people usually have two main spaces in life, home and work. And Starbucks comes along and says, hey, we can kind of be this third space, which is a hybrid between those two spaces. A great place to work, but also a great place to relax. Now, the strategy seemed to have worked. In the last 20 years or so, Starbucks gained this massive kind of cult-like following that particularly comprises of, well, yeah.
Vanilla soft top and caramel drizzle and extra sugar sprinkles. Yeah, that's me.
Anyways, a massive following like this requires a bit of coffee. A shit ton, actually. Starbucks currently buys around 3% of the entire world's coffee supply, particularly from these countries in this region called the Coffee Belt. This part of the world is situated between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, and it most notably includes countries like Brazil, Vietnam, Ethiopia, and another country that I'll dive into later. The point being is that this is where Starbucks gets their coffee from, and none of these countries are really global superpowers by any means. So to combat exploitative working conditions and bigger companies taking advantage of farmers in these countries, something called fair trade was developed. Fair Trade International sets the standards for what is considered fair trade, such as paying farmers a minimum price for the coffee beans and not using children to farm them. You know, decent, humane stuff. What is interesting is that Starbucks doesn't use this. They instead opted to create their own certification program called Coffee and Farmer Equity Practices, also known as C.A.F.E. This is a program that is sort of similar to fair trade, with some interesting caveats. Now, alarm bells should be ringing here. Why does Starbucks need to create their own farmer equity practice, which is conveniently not very transparent about where they get their coffee from? Well, it sounds like it probably benefits them financially.
Obviously.
And this is going to be my first addition to the board of disappointment. But in order to understand that better, let's follow the money. You know, you could just make coffee at home for 50 cents instead of buying it for $7.
Starbucks is too expensive for you. You're poor.
My bad. Here's why your cup of coffee is pretty expensive to most people. First, like we mentioned earlier, you have the farmers in the Coffee Belt region. These are the guys who actually do the field work and get your coffee beans off the plant. Next comes the importers and exporters. With Starbucks, it's most of their people handling this part of the process. These are the people who get the coffee from the farm and deal with all the logistics to get it to the next people, the roasters and processors. Starbucks coffee gets roasted and bagged up in their own separate facilities and finally gets shipped to the store to get ground up, served with some corn syrup derivative, and finally served to you, the customer. That's what the baristas do. There you go, that's the simplified supply chain. But we forgot a key ingredient of the operation, and it's not that sweet pumpkin sauce.
What?
It's Starbucks corporate, the people who get paid millions to oversee the whole operation. These are the puppet masters, pretty common in most organizations. What's not common, especially in most retail organizations, is how much their CEO makes. Brian Nicole was the second highest paid CEO in 2024 out of all of the companies on the S&P 500. Starbucks inked that Supermax deal to acquire him from Chipotle because, well, he did pretty good over there. He's like the Shohei Ohtani of business school graduates.
Oh my gosh! Shohei!
That's a scientific term, by the way. So yeah, the top executives rake in millions. Some of them multiple millions. They're taking a large chunk of that $7 coffee. Admittedly, they get paid well to make sure their supply chain is making as little as possible too. This is gonna be my second addition to the board of disappointment. Starbucks claims they're all about listening to partners. But when partners start asking for better pay and rights, they pretty much start ignoring them and delaying negotiations.
It took months for the company to respond to most of those demands.
There's a very clear strategy to simply run out the clock.
They're pretty much one of the worst companies when it comes to union busting, even up there with the big names like Amazon.
You son of a bitch.
Don't be asking for $1 from corporate, bro.
What?
Therefore, Starbucks baristas make anywhere from $15 to $19 an hour. Pretty standard stuff. If you're in New York, that's less than the price of a burger and fries. So baristas that are ringing up that $7 drink are making a smaller chunk of the profit. And the farther you go down the supply chain, the less people are generally making. But by far and away, the people getting screwed the most from this are the farmers. Once you're done distributing the $7 from that cup of coffee, there's about a dime left for whatever farm grew those beans. And it certainly seems like the C.A.F.E system is partly to blame for this. No guaranteed price for farmers, no public list of where to buy the coffee from, and no independent oversight of those farms. Most of the auditing that's done is from third-party firms that are paid by Starbucks themselves. See how that might be an issue? You can't even trace the farm where those beans came from. This is not just a PR greenwashing scheme that doesn't really help farmers though. It gets deeper than that. The story I mentioned earlier about John is really nothing new. In fact, his name isn't even John. He just filed under the name John Doe out of fear of retaliation with 7 other workers. Starbucks used to claim 100% ethical sourcing until the National Consumers League sued them for something similar to this. How do they respond? They bumped the number down to 99%. Typical large corporation behavior. That's going on the board of disappointment too. But John was from Brazil, which is one of the largest coffee producers in the world. Let's look at a different country that's closer to Starbucks' largest market. Mexico is a little farther down the list. Still boasting quite a bit of production, and since it's closer to the US, you would think Starbucks might buy a good amount from there. Too bad they don't tell us. Thanks, guys. What we do know is this. A few activist groups that include Coffee Watch, Empower, and ProDesk dropped a 100-page report with the title Exploitation and Opacity. Their main argument is that Starbucks uses ethical sourcing claims to mask widespread labor abuses in their supply chain, mainly focusing on farms in Mexico. Now, this is what happened in Brazil too. What is interesting about Mexico, according to this report, is that Starbucks has, quote, opaque relationships with the Mexican government. Specifically these 2 organizations, FIRA, which is the Trust Funds for Rural Development, and INIFAB, which is the National Institute of Forestry, Agriculture, and Livestock Research. It was stated that Starbucks received funding from these 2 organizations to help their sourcing and development operations in Mexico. And despite using public money, Starbucks has refused to disclose key information about the exact use of these funds, the farms they source from, and the working conditions on those farms. And Mexican authorities don't really care to disclose anything either, even with some of those farms being reportedly linked to serious labor violations. Another thing to add to the board of disappointment. I understand wanting to be private about information that could give your competitors an advantage, but it seems like this information is being hidden for different reasons. What we do know is that the average coffee farmer in Mexico makes $106 per month, a salary that is well below the poverty line. So it seems like Starbucks' supply chain focuses on primarily getting the product to the consumer, but they put an emphasis on screwing as many people in the process as possible, while also trying to stuff the pockets of upper management. How else could their CEO get a $100 million pay package? I'm not here to pick on him though, it's just a flawed system. Starbucks didn't invent this business model, they just perfected it. When you look at the numbers, the lawsuits, the reports, the people who actually grow the coffee, it doesn't seem very human. It feels disappointing. The economics of Starbucks aren't broken. They actually work exactly as intended. And that might be the most disappointing thing of all. Thanks for watching.